Right. Okay. Okay, Pete. This is, I think, probably our final piece for today.
Well, let's just recap very quickly on how we got to where we are in terms of these sessions. We started off with problems. We broke those down into input side issues around the way that stuff arrives into the system, and then we looked at the problems of the emissions and so forth. We moved on to solutions, initially around sticks, which is, if you like, an input, another input side thing. I like to think about these things in sort of logical boxes. That was about governments and threats and taxes and so forth.
Yeah.
And then we looked at the proactive sides of that process in terms of supply chains, the role of brands going forward. And we mustn't forget that, of course, these major brands that dominate food and non-food products, they have a vested interest in the planet continuing. So that's a pretty strong incentive. Yeah. It's no longer about necessarily just growth and profit, because if you're sawing off the branch that you're sitting on, then we don't go anywhere. So let's now end on a positive note.
Just to capture that, I mean, they actually realise that we're somehow dependent on nature?
They do realise. I believe that right at the tops of these companies, in part due to the result of the work from, say, the Cambridge Environmental Leaders Forum and Forum for the Future, that was founded by Jonathan Porritt and Sarah Parkin and Professor Paul Ekins. They did some very valuable work, and for years they've been putting into the system, in the UK context, many, it was about 60, 70 graduates a year, I believe. And these people have now been input into the system. They're rising to senior roles on the boards of major companies.
It's very important, because it's actually getting the idea of cooperating with nature.
Well, yeah, and I revert back to the supply chain issue, because in this session I think we do need now to think around the the social issues and how these things are likely to come together and impact on...
Because all technical change requires a social change.
Absolutely. It's no good having the technology if it's unaffordable, so you need the technology to be affordable, and increasingly for a variety of reasons it is. And then finally, of course, the other leg of that tripod is that society, people, have to understand and appreciate from within that this is a good thing and not a bad thing.
Even if it's just learning how to use a lovely new smartphone or something.
Very much so. Yeah. And the role of brands, one of the reasons why I'm optimistic in this space is that, of course, subtly the brands are realising that if one of the constraints to growth is the fact that resources are limited, then all of a sudden you realise that the growth of your brand will be limited. I think a classic example of that was the activities of the beverage companies in India, where they were drilling tube wells, and all of a sudden, of course, to access the water for their plants, they were realising that all the adjacent tube wells from their potential customer base were all running dry, because they were actually abstracting it to produce soft drinks. And so all of a sudden, businesses are now realising that they've got to work with a grain of social acceptability, and more people are educated through information technology. YouTube and Twitter can be immensely damaging, and the value of the brand names in all the large global corporates can be destroyed very quickly through not understanding the grain of that environmental flow.
Just as we see with the Arab Spring, that new technology is used to show how awful some security forces behave.
Exactly, and in the political framework, they've got a massive role to play. Not necessarily in providing, but at least giving the appetite to access sound scientific data. One wouldn't say that necessarily the nature of social networks is scientifically correct, but it
is part of a feedback system.
But it is part of a feedback loop that actually enables people in far more broad dimensions. So the brands are going to do that, and sometimes they're going to do it very subtly. When I was 20, I didn't really conceptually identify with the need for an iPod. Not that I've got one now either, but the fact is that many services get introduced with low environmental impacts, through miniaturization, through the displacement of video, to CDs, to iPods and to downloads, so that we move into this virtual space. That is a subtle process. Not necessarily, I've got to be realistic, it's not necessarily driven purely by environmental demands, but actually many of those innovations are done against a backdrop that the environmental impact has at least got to be no greater. Yes. Because that is now on the radar of these innovators.
And there are other factors on the social side, like ease of use, affordability, as you were saying, and it's practical to use and easy to adopt, and all those sorts of things.
So those the brands and supply chains will be doing it subtly for society. Cars are another example. Lightweighting of cars, substitution of metals for plastics in terms of, if you like, straightforward capitalist objectives of reduced costs, but indirect benefits in terms of lightweighting, better fuel economy, lower emissions, partly regulatory, partly self-interest by the car brands. That's one area. Now, let's think about these other issues. Well, of course, I think that in a social context, there are opportunities around the fact that although people living longer and aging is actually an environmental problem, because without sort of going too deep into this area, you effectively end up with the individual not only being more individuals, but if they're around for longer, then very crudely the mass of their impact on the planet is going to be that much greater. The so-called retention time extends, and older people, particularly in certain climates, need cooling or heating. They need more intensive care and medical systems. So there's quite a lot of environmental baggage there. But on the other hand, what it's doing in terms of psychology is making people realise that compared to when the average life expectancy was 50, if you live to 70, 80 and 90, and if you have children and grandchildren, then suddenly people have a much more vivid understanding of the physical world being different compared to the time that it was when they began to remember things around the age of 4 or 5 or 6. So it's this association with the sheer knowledge about, coupled to increased media coverage about the impacts of the climate impacts, more typhoons, more climate chaos, I think, rather than
yes, exactly.
warming. I think warming gives a wrong impression.
Absolutely.
But it's this personal experience through greater longevity that will actually, this planet that I took for granted and assumed that when I was a boy, in the winter you got westerlies, in the summer you hit
what you're saying, in a sense,
pressures.
as people live longer, they've got to actually fundamentally they need to experience a real change in worldview.
Well then, as politicians and the population at large do that, you then get this communication across 2 or 3 or even 3 generations, which is unprecedented for our species. In Victorian times, the people that sort of were operating in the dark satanic mills were literally unable to travel much in the 1840s and 50s before the railway spread. And they didn't necessarily, through short life mortality, have the experience of their parents or certainly their grandparents in terms of living on the land in the early 1700s.
Because like today, we might
they died.
We might relearn and readapt some of the knowledge and skills that our grandparents had to use resources more effectively and
absolutely
improve and maintain the quality of life, but reduce the cost of living, which is key. It's reducing our cost of living and serving the environment at the same time. I think there has to be an economic piece to it.
There has to be an economic piece.
And people.
And so it's the sheer awareness of that and the ability of improved communication with or without information technology that can actually relay that word. And it's this realisation that then drives buy-in. Now, the other drivers, I think, this is maybe peculiar to the UK, we actually have very specific advantages, as I perceive them, at this particular moment in a global context. we've got, despite the current issues, but we have got access to an awful lot of investment and funding. We are a global centre for finance. We have got an immense intellectual bank in terms of our universities, their centres of excellence across all the conventional fields of science and technology. We do have a fairly concentrated population of high ethnic diversity, particularly in London. So we've got a pretty good market testing framework, and we have got a stable political framework with effective rule of law and so on. Now, against that backdrop, therefore, this is an immense opportunity. If we can re-gear our economy into a low-carbon phase, we've got a tremendous chance to then sell our services to the world, and that's